Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now it's time to have a go at making the Kessel Run as we venture into a galaxy far, far away and take a look at the Star Wars universe. Now so far on this channel we've kind of skirted around Star Wars a little bit, around on the outer rims as it were. I've mentioned it a few times, but I've not done a proper video on it, and I thought it was about time to change that. Now also, I haven't caught up on the Mandalorian yet, so don't worry, there won't be any spoilers in this video. No, instead, I'm going to be covering a much maligned aspect of the Star Wars canon, and that of course is the prequel trilogy. Now before you click away, let me just qualify that by saying that the prequel trilogy is by no means my favourite part of the Star Wars canon. But it's also not my least favourite. There are a few redeeming aspects, and I think it gets a lot more hate than it deserves. Now there are a lot of reasons why a lot of Star Wars fans don't like the prequels, and I'm going to go through quite a few of those points in this video, and underline why I think either they were necessary steps, or why I think that gets a bit too much criticism. There are some instances, however, that I can't excuse what goes on. However, I'm going to start off with the over-reliance on CGI. Now, this is a really common aspect that people come to often, time and time again, as to why the prequels don't work as well. However, I don't think you can really blame anyone involved in the making of these films for using CGI. It was a new technology around this time really, and it just it was necessary. The sort of limitations that CGI had at the time weren't fully anticipated, sure, but CGI was definitely the way to create this massive galaxy in this sort of other world. It was a perfect technology to use to create the Galactic Civil War. The issue is, this technology was in its infancy. If you did it now with some of the technology they use for things like Endgame and that kind of thing, they would look a lot better. And I think that's the biggest problem that people come to. The issue is that they just didn't really foresee that this would not be sort of a long-lasting thing, that these prequels wouldn't have the same longevity as the early ones. Although the technology wasn't as good in the original trilogy, because of that somehow the universe looks lived in, it looks like it's real, it looks like sort of worn out sci-fi, and because of that weirdly makes it last a hell of a lot longer. However, dodgy CGI is something that definitely ages. I mean, just take the Scorpion King movie for example. I don't think, however, you can blame them. As I said, I just think that this is technology that they had to use at the time. Perhaps their over-reliance was a bit of a mistake. Maybe they could have relied a little bit more on some practical effects. God knows they had the opportunity. I mean, a lot of the prequels take part on Tatooine. Why couldn't they just go back to the deserts for a lot of that? And they did. That's the thing, they did. The issue is Coruscant. That was the main issue. It just looks too shiny, too clean, and that was a lot of what people had problems with. I don't disagree with those statements, but I do think you've got to cut them some slack on this. It's something that, of course, they were going to do. Now, the next thing that a lot of people say is that these films are boring. And I can see where those people are coming from because there are a lot of trade negotiations and Senate hearings and that kind of stuff. It's almost a bit like a political drama set in space, and while I do see the criticism, I also think that these scenes are completely necessary. At the end of the day, we needed a way to get from the Jedi ruling over a sort of fairly peaceful galaxy to the state of things in the main trilogy, as alluded to by Ben Kenobi. When he says that there was a Clone Wars and all that kind of stuff, and now the Galactic Empire have a sort of sovereignty over the universe, there needs to be a reason for that. There needs to be a sort of justifiable war, a reason for this war to start. And how better to do that than have Palpatine as this master manipulator, bringing both sides up to fighting force and then pitting them against each other to gain political power. All of this is necessary, however it could have just been executed a little bit better, and I think that's probably a running theme that's going to go on here. I think most of the criticism really could be boiled down to how well this was achieved. I think they made a lot of the right decisions, but there are also a few mistakes along the way that meant that these films just didn't quite have the same feeling as the early ones. Now, another thing you can say in defense of them not being boring is sort of all the exciting points and all the battles that came out of this trilogy. I mean, I could sit here and list a whole bunch of them, whether it be the Duel of the Fates, the battle between Obi-Wan and Anakin, the space battle above Coruscant, and many other examples that come to mind, where I consider sort of big set points that happen throughout the Star Wars saga. And while boiling it down to these small points doesn't excuse the fact that the rest of the films are a little bit boring, you can't deny that there are so many iconic moments throughout the prequel trilogy that become the most beloved parts of the entire franchise. I think there's probably a few more scenes in these films that I think are more iconic than even some of the ones in the original trilogy. Feel free to hate me in the comments for that, but I do think it's true. Now on to a point that I find a lot harder to excuse, and that of course is the romance between Anakin and Padme. Now, I do think this is a necessary part of the story. It's completely essential that we see Anakin's motivation, that we see a real human side of his character. Part of this whole conflict and his turmoil between deciding whether the Jedi are the right course or whether he adopts some of these more dark side powers is because he wants to have a family and he has these desires that are natural. It's something that the Jedi really are denying him, and it's one of the flaws that the Jedi really have. Their unwillingness to embrace sort of love and connection to other people ends up being their downfall in quite a notable way. The issue once again here is just the delivery of it. You just don't believe this romance. At least, I never did. It starts off obviously in The Phantom Menace, and at this point you've got a very odd age gap. Anakin is a very young child, and you've got Padme as a kind of teenager. Their relationship is much more like an older sister and a little brother, and that kind of puts this whole creepy vibe on the rest of their relationship going forward. When it comes to Attack of the Clones, you get this weird he's kind of luring after her, and it's a bit creepy, so much so that Padme even says to his face that he's creeping her out. And yet, in that same film, for some reason she falls head over heels for him. It's bizarre, it doesn't really make a huge amount of sense, and it doesn't feel natural at all, and I think that is a lot of the problem. Now, some people do say, in its defense, that perhaps he's using some sort of manipulation, using the Force to make her fall in love with him. However, no such ability is ever really alluded to other than Jedi mind tricks, and that's only supposed to work on the weak of mind. Also, in no way in these films do they allude to that at all. They don't even make a slight reference that he's even considering doing such a thing. Overall, this relationship just feels completely bizarre, and it feels like they were kind of missing an entire another film somewhere in Attack of the Clones where they were able to get a bit more development of this love story, and because of that the whole thing feels completely rushed. They go from a weird kind of sibling thing to this weird level of disgust, how she doesn't want to even consider him in that way, to being soulmates, and so much so that when her heart breaks, she literally dies. There's just so much wrong with this relationship, and it's a huge part of why these films don't really work for a lot of people. And as I said, I find this one much harder to defend. Now, I've come across the point that it's been poorly executed quite a few times, and that brings me on to my next sort of point in this whole thing. I've thought now for a while that really when you look at it as a whole, and when you're really objective about it, Star Wars is a bit rubbish. Now, I don't mean this in a bad way, weirdly. What I love about Star Wars is its sort of campy cheapness. I love the fact that it is a bit rubbish, that the story is a bit obvious. That's fine, I have no problems with that. In fact, it's something that I really hold dear about, especially the original trilogy. And it's something that a lot of people, I think, forget about the original trilogy as well. It's always held up there on a pedestal, but there are so many issues with it. Whether that be because A New Hope is slightly slow and a little bit lacking in action, or whether the fact that Empire Strikes Back is actually not a very good standalone film. Admittedly, it's probably one of the best ones in there, but if you just take it as an entity on its own, it doesn't have a proper ending, you can't really follow it if you didn't watch A New Hope very much, and it's just not perfect in that way as well. And then a lot of people don't like a lot of aspects of Return of the Jedi, whether that be the fact that they don't really like the Ewoks, they don't like the fact that the Ewoks so easily defeated a bunch of stormtroopers, or many of the other different aspects that come into this film as well. Now, again, I'm don't mean to be down on Star Wars. Like I say, I love it. I love every aspect of it, and there are some parts of the franchise that are wonderful. The Mandalorian is a perfect example. It's a really, really well-crafted series, and on top of that, there's also the animated series, which are really loved by a lot of people. And as well as that, even some of the games have some of the best stories that I've ever come across, whether that be KOTOR or Fallen Order. So much of this is so good and adds so much to the canon, but I think that's kind of what makes them good, is the fact that they're kind of peripheral to the main sort of saga. I think part of what is the big issue in Star Wars is the expectation. It's why the sequel trilogy didn't do really well when you think about it. It did amazingly, don't get me wrong, they did fantastically at the box office, and a lot of people do really love them. However, there are a lot of Star Wars fans out there who think that they kind of fell flat a little bit, particularly The Last Jedi, which even that I do think is also underrated, but that's probably a video for another time. I won't get into that right now. The thing is though, they've been living in the shadow of these built-up expectations for so many years. The sort of nostalgia in everyone's mind that the original trilogy was this sort of pedestal of amazingness. But when you look at it, it wasn't really. At no point really has Star Wars been sort of Oscar-worthy films, not by any stretch of the imagination, but what we love about them is all of those flaws, all the bits about it that aren't fantastic. And maybe that's why we should start liking the prequels a bit more. Admittedly, they're not perfect films, but they are very good. They've got a lot of entertainment value to them, a little bit more action than the original ones, but they've also still got a lot of this trade negotiations and all that kind of stuff that does make it quite interesting. It has a lot of backstory and lore in there as well, and although it does have a lot of flaws, like the sequels, and like the original trilogy, it knows it's not perfect in a way. It's trying to please the fans, but it never can. At the end of the day, we live in a culture that is amazingly hypercritical of things, whether this be good or bad. Whenever a film comes out, there's 100 different YouTube videos that are sort of reviewing it, criticizing it, doing whatever, coming up with theories. And that's another aspect I think that comes into Star Wars a lot of the time. It's theorizing, it's sort of fan rights, it's all that kind of stuff, fan films even. So many people, so many fans have their ways that they want everything to go. Everyone wants things to happen in a different way, and that's why things like The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker were so maligned. People had a sort of idea that they wanted, so many people came up with these theories about how things could turn out, and as soon as they didn't do that, of course people were going to be disappointed. The thing is about Star Wars that you've always got to remember though, is that even from the beginning, I've never considered George Lucas to be the best writer in the world. His idea of story is quite good, and his sort of overarching sort of ideas for where he wants his story to go were pretty decent. However, what really makes him a fantastic sort of producer or director, whatever you might call him, is his world building, and it's something that he shares with people like J.R.R. Tolkien and J.K. Rowling. It's something that really, I think, is his main talent, and it was building this universe that time and time again we want to revisit for one reason or another. Whether that be through a game, whether that be through a film, a series, a cartoon series, or even Galaxy's Edge in Anaheim. So often, fans want to come back to this galaxy and they want to explore different parts of it all the time. And I think that that is what truly makes Star Wars remarkable. It's got this sort of world about it that really just keeps growing, keeps expanding, and you feel like there's no limit to where it could go, and that's why when you see something that doesn't happen the way you want it to, you get disappointed. There was so much scope, there were so many options for what they could do, and then they ended up basically repeating A New Hope. I can see why you might be disappointed in that. But that doesn't mean that these films should be criticised so much in that way. They're still great, there's still additional content that you can love, and you can still theorise and do whatever you want around the outside of it. And all of those other aspects, all of those peripherals that we love so much, still exist too. So overall, I think in the prequels they do a really good job with this story, to be honest with you. I think they're telling us what we want to hear. They're going into a lot of the backstory on both the Emperor and Darth Vader, who are these two mysterious pillars leading the Empire in the original trilogy. And I think they do achieve this quite well. They focus on them quite a lot, to sometimes the detriment of some other characters. We don't get enough of Qui-Gon Jinn or Count Dooku, who are these really complex characters that we learn about a lot more in the sort of supporting materials. But that's necessary. After all, this is the Skywalker saga, and obviously has a lot of connection to the Emperor, but it is mostly about them, and that is the reason for it. Also, once again, these peripherals still exist. All of this content about Dooku and Qui-Gon is still out there, it's just not in the main 9 films. Now, finally on to probably the 2 most hated aspects of the prequel trilogy. And that, of course, is Jar Jar Binks and midichlorians. Yes, I know, the M word. Starting off with Jar Jar, and of course he's not a great character, let's be honest with you. There's a lot of sort of racist overtones with the way that he's portrayed, he's annoying, he's just sort of this injection of comedy that wasn't ever really needed. I never felt like it was screaming out for a comic relief character, especially when so many of the main cast are capable of achieving this. However, I do think that there was potential with him. I do think that these theories out there that he was supposed to be the true Dark Lord of the Sith are quite interesting. However, I actually don't think they would really work within the context. At the end of the day, I think Palpatine kind of needed to be the main big bad. But I think Jar Jar Binks is definitely another one of those things that is hard for me to excuse. He does just sort of serve a purpose in these films. However, they could have done something different with the character. There could have been any number of different ways to portray this character instead of the way that they went with, that still filled the same gap. So now finally onto midichlorians. Now, these are probably the most criticised aspect of the prequel trilogy. Basically, the main argument against them is that they kind of remove a lot of the mystery about the Force. They quantify it. They make it so that only if you have a high midichlorian count can you even be a member of the Jedi Order. Now, here's one of my most controversial opinions I've ever had, but I actually like midichlorians. Now, I don't like the way that they were used. In fact, I don't like anything about how they were utilised in The Phantom Menace, to be honest with you. However, it does provide a few hints as to what I think actually goes on with midichlorians. What I think is it shows a failing of the Jedi Order. Now, here's what I mean by that. I think that there is a correlation between midichlorians and your ability to use the Force. I don't think that is in doubt at all. However, I don't think it's the only thing that contributes to it. I think that if you have a low midichlorian count, you can control the Force pretty well. You could even go on to become a very powerful Jedi or Dark Force user. That's not an issue, I don't think. However, I do think that there is probably a higher percentage that you're going to be more adept with the Force if you have a high midichlorian count. And here's where I think the Jedi Order come in. Now, the Jedi always used to be just sort of a much less sort of constrictive sort of force in the galaxy. There used to be teachings, there used to be all these restrictions still, however, it felt a lot more like you could be trained quite easily, there wasn't as much of a formality to it and all that kind of stuff. However, when the Jedi Council become this humongous presence in the sort of whole Galactic Republic, it becomes a lot more difficult. Things have to be restricted a lot more. As the galaxy expands and more species join the Senate, more and more people want their kids to become Jedi and become the enforcers in the galaxy. However, the Jedi need some way of very, very quickly whittling this down into a few choice candidates who can join the programs. And because of that, they went with midichlorians. And the reason for this is I think that the midichlorians is just the best way they have of measuring someone's sort of Force sensitivity before sort of subjecting them to years of training. I think it's just a quick way of weaseling out a lot of people who they don't think will be a good match. It means that they do miss people, it means that some people will slip through the gaps, but I think that this is something that was kind of a necessity as the Jedi Order sort of became a lot more in demand. As the Jedi numbers needed to increase a lot more again, back as to how they were in the Mandalorian Wars, it just became necessary for them to find the strongest people they possibly could at any one time. Now, I think because of this, they get into a lot of sort of controversy. The thing is, the way that we see it is that midichlorians are the be-all and end-all. If you have midichlorians, you can be a Force user. If you don't, you can't. And I think that this is a mistake. This is something that is portrayed to us. However, I think it's that portrayal that shows that the Jedi really aren't in their right mindset. We're shown countless hints throughout these prequels, and of course in The Last Jedi as well, that the Jedi failed. They failed to see the presence of the Dark Lord of the Sith rise up from within them effectively. And they also just sort of didn't realise that Anakin was turning to the dark side as well. They failed to see that his emotions really could get the better of him if they weren't treated properly, and no one treated him properly with it. Even Obi-Wan, his friend and practically his brother, sort of just told him to suppress his emotions, and this is something that isn't healthy. It's something actually that I really hope that they cover in the Obi-Wan series. Maybe Obi-Wan has a crisis of faith and he actually realises that human emotion is necessary. Who'd have thought, huh? Now I think if they introduced a few of these aspects into the film, maybe midichlorians could have been redeemed. I do think that they are an interesting concept, they were just, again, really poorly executed. I think that there are a lot of failings though of the Jedi Order just like this, so many in fact I would love to make another video covering all of these things. If you'd like to see me talk about how the Jedi Order failed, please leave a comment and let me know if you want to see it. I'd love to get working on a theory about that, why the Jedi Order failed over this whole period. But I'll get onto that another time, hopefully. Also, try not to slate me too much for defending midichlorians. I'm only human, alright? And with that being said, I think that's it for this video. I think I'll leave it there. There's a lot more that I would like to cover, but as I said, I think I'll do that in other videos. What are your thoughts on the prequels though? Please let me know down in the comments below. I just think that they are such an enjoyable set of films, even with all their flaws. But what you've got to remember, like I said, is that so much of the Star Wars franchise has similar flaws. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content here. Thank you so much for watching, and may the Force be with you.